We are well into War and Peace now, and in part 2 of volume 1 we see a shift from the drawing room to the battlefield, and we will see another shift from the battlefield to a more spiritual realm, or at least Tolstoy will give us a glimpse of that spiritual realm, the realm of the soul. And indeed that realm is foreshadowed here on the battlefield in much the same way that Tolstoy foreshadowed the battlefield in the drawing room. War and Peace is an incredibly layered and complex work of literature. It's rather like experiencing a symphony or an opera. When you reread War and Peace, you'll notice things, you'll hear sounds, you'll discern notes that foreshadow things to come and recall ideas and events already seeded in the story. And so War and Peace certainly rewards rereading. Now, a note on first reading versus rereading. It has been extraordinary to note how overwhelmingly positive the response to War and Peace has been so far. Many first readers expected to be launched straight into battle and were pleasantly surprised to find themselves confronted with the social politics of high society and Tolstoy's delightful irony and humour. But my note on first reading versus rereading is this: some readers will most certainly prefer one domain over the other. They'll prefer one world, the world of the drawing room, the salon, the ballrooms, or the battlefield. Now, my advice is to bring that which resonated with you in one world to the other world, because they're kind of the same. They have an extraordinary amount of commonalities, and that's part of the comment that Tolstoy is making. If you find yourself naturally drawn to the battle scenes, for example, if you love generals poring over maps and thinking about strategy, then bring that passion and that interest into the drawing room, and vice versa. Now, another note before we launch into our discussion on this section, a note on liking or disliking characters. Many rereaders of War and Peace utterly adore these characters. They love these characters. And this can be rather disorienting for a first-time reader who is listening to people talk about how they love these characters so much, because they come into Tolstoy's world and maybe they think, okay, these characters are layered and they're complex, but they're not particularly likable. Is there something wrong with me for not liking these characters? And the answer is absolutely not. Those who are rereading War and Peace, the love comes from anticipation, because they have experienced growth with these characters. They have seen them mature, they have seen how they act in the world changes, how they think about different things changes, and they have that experience of growing close to them. And so rereaders are much more likely to have strong affection for certain characters because they're already aware of their arc and they are anticipating it. And of course, it's much easier to take Maria's advice to her brother, to understand, because it's much easier to forgive if you understand. It's much easier to forgive these characters very early on if you understand them. And this is the marvellous thing about Tolstoy. One of the many marvellous things is he gives us these real people who are flawed, but we learn to understand them, and our affection for them grows. We even realise that they are essentially us, or people who we know in our lives. And it's interesting that in this section, in the second episode, Kutuzov actually echoes what Maria says. He says, we all have our little weaknesses. This is a marvellous echo of Princess Maria's advice. We all have our little weaknesses. And so we valiantly try to understand one another so that we can forgive and love. Love is a verb, it's a doing word, it's an action, and it is a choice, and it's much easier to make that choice if we understand one another. And so Tolstoy wants to give us that experience of maybe not particularly liking some of these characters when we first meet them, and then we grow to, and that results in some really powerful literature. And indeed, when I first came to War and Peace, I most certainly did not love some of the characters who we meet early on, but now I do. Of course, a good example is Andrei. He's not particularly likeable very early on. He's not doing much to endear us to him. And I also personally disliked Pierre when I first met him, which causes me some upset to contemplate now because I simply adore him. I read those earlier scenes and I want to put my arm around him. I want to look after him. And in a sense, that feeling is born out of my desire to look after myself or to be looked after. I understand him. But in order to have that crystallizing feeling of understanding, you need to move from a position of not understanding. And of course, you're not going to understand somebody who you haven't spent much time with. And one of the joys of rereading great literature arises from deploying an exercise gifted to us by St. Augustine, an exercise known as the threefold present, or connecting to the threefold present, connecting to eternity. In the text, what you do is when you read through the work before you, you attempt to ground yourself in the present moment. But as you do so, you are also simultaneously cognizant of that which you have relegated to the recent past, that which you have just read. And not only that, but you are anticipating what is to come. So you are connecting with the threefold present. You are connecting with eternity. And indeed, Tolstoy is going to give us a lot to mull over when it comes to eternity. Now, let's dive into part 2 of volume 1. Now, as we continue to march on through Tolstoy's War and Peace, let's broach the great man theory. And I would like to seed something for you to ponder over as we continue to read, something that we will capitalize on. My question to you is, who is responsible for creating history? And another question off the back of that is, how much free will do we have? How much volition do we have? How much agency do we have? In the lead up to the Battle of Austerlitz and in the Battle of Schöngraben, we get a sense that a lot more goes into the creation of history than simply great men, naturally born with certain attributes, exerting their will. Time and again, we see mistakes, miscommunications and blunders. And Tolstoy is keen to draw our attention to that. He is keen to draw our attention to the millions of different variables that eventually lead to what we read in the history books. Now, the great man theory, this idea that great men like Julius Caesar, like Napoleon, had a strong, decisive effect on the course of history. This idea is commonly attributed to Thomas Carlyle, who gave a series of lectures in 1840 on heroism, which you can actually read in a book on heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history. Thomas Carlyle thought that the history of the world was but the biography of great men. And he put forth his analysis of 6 different types of great men. Shakespeare, for example, is the archetype of the poet, yeah? He fits the poet type of great man, whilst Napoleon fit the king type of great man. Here's Thomas Carlyle, who said, "Universal history, the history of what man has accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of great men who have worked here. They were the leaders of men, these great ones, the modelers, patterns, and in a wide sense, creators." Keep that idea of being a creator in mind, because if Tolstoy is going to take the great man theory to task, then who is the creator to Tolstoy? So Carlyle says that these great men are creators of whatsoever the general mass of men contrived to do or to attain. So that's an important qualification. So it's almost like these great men are vessels or channels for something wider. They channel a collective impulse. They are history personified. And indeed we get this sense that Napoleon, for example, is an embodiment of the ideals of the French Revolution. As Pierre said in the first part, he took those ideals on, what the people wanted, and he transcended it. And so Carlyle goes on to say that all things that we see standing accomplished in the world are properly the outer material result. Pay attention to that, the outer material result. Again, important for our reading of War and Peace, because there is a real contrast between the external and the internal, and there's quite a lot of relentless commentary on this. So what we see in the world is the outer material result, the externalization of what was once inside these great men, the practical realization and embodiment of thoughts that dwelt in the great men sent into the world. They think it and then they make it so. The soul of the whole world's history, it may justly be considered, were the history of these. Now, of course, there are many qualifications and different ways that one could either rally behind the great man theory or refute it. Carlyle believed that great men weren't the only factor in history, they were the decisive one, the decisive factor. And indeed, I do personally see some credence to this idea that great men are channels for something that is of their time, of their era, of their nation. Ezra Pound told us that poets and writers were the antenna of the human race. It explains why many different writers who are working at the same time, who do not read each other or are not even really aware of each other, somehow end up writing about much the same thing at much the same time. They're picking up on something. And so we get some nuances come in. So Shakespeare, for example, is a great man, but is Shakespeare really Shakespeare? How individual is Shakespeare? Is he not simply all of us distilled and reflected back at us? And then, of course, we get this idea of genius thrown into the mix. Is genius born or made? Is it a product of nature or nurture? If individual genius is a product of nature, what does that say about the idea of free will? Not only for us, but for the great men. But of course, if genius is the product of nurture, our environment, then what does that say about free will? Because ultimately, there is a real limit to how much we can control external variables. Maybe we can control a few, but there are so many, and there are so many conflicting wills in the world that we are brushing up against, that we could very much be excused for flipping between two extremes. At one moment thinking we do have free will, and at another moment thinking that we have absolutely no free will, and perhaps we land somewhere in the middle. Perhaps we start to think, well, we have limited free will or volition within a scope. We say that history is written by the victors, and there is truth in that. But in this book, in War and Peace, where we are exposed to moral victories on the side of the Russians, so losses essentially, a moral victory is not a victory. We say that history is written by the victors, and yet we are still reading. We are reading about these individual losses. And we could chalk these losses on the Russians' side, on the Austrians' side. We could chalk these up to Napoleon's decisiveness. We could say that they were due to the exemplary tactics of Napoleon's Grande Armée. They, of course, were very, very strong. They were relentlessly well-trained and regimented. And they had seen a lot of combat. Napoleon's Grande Armée was really impressive. Impressive all by itself, but even more impressive when we compare Napoleon's troops to, say, the Russians' troops. Simply put, they really knew what they were doing, and they were working under a master tactician. Now, despite the strength of Napoleon's Grande Armée, there was some attrition going on. There are only so many campaigns you can embark upon. There are only so many times you can see combat before your effectiveness starts to dull. But in regards to Napoleon's military successes, and one man's victory is another man's loss, we could say that success was brought about by his will, or we could say it was brought about by the other side's mistakes. Both would be true. We're basically saying the same thing. If you play a game of chess, you may leave yourself open, and your opponent may choose to capitalize upon and expose that weakness. So who is responsible for how that game is going to go down in record? So we're kind of saying the same thing, except one viewpoint is buying into the great man theory and the other isn't. And indeed we see this dichotomy between great man and will other than the individual embodied in the two great historical personages of Napoleon and Kutuzov. Napoleon is exemplar when it comes to being a personification, a manifestation of the great man theory, a man striding through battle, leading his troops and exerting his will over reality and creating history. Kutuzov, on the other hand, seems fully aware that there are many different factors that are ultimately beyond his or even anybody's control when it comes to battle and when it comes to history. Now, the interesting thing about history, or the interesting thing about War and Peace, is how marvelously Tolstoy gives us the events. Tolstoy knew his history. And when you read through War and Peace, you may as well be reading very accurate and fair historical accounts, of course given a little bit of narrative drive and some characterization. But Tolstoy really got his history nailed, and this becomes evident when you place War and Peace or certain passages in this masterpiece up against historical record. Now, if you would like to do that, there is a tremendous biography of Kutuzov that is highly recommended. It's pretty big, it's quite hefty, but you really don't need another biography of Kutuzov. This one by Alexander Mikaberidze is brilliant. The writer is an expert on the Napoleonic era, and there is great pleasure to be had in comparing the chapters in, say, part 2 of volume 1 up against the corresponding chapters in this marvellous biography. It certainly is not a prerequisite to do so, but it certainly affords us a really delightful deep dive and will certainly sate the curiosity of those readers who love learning about history. The corresponding chapters would be chapters 12 to 15, beginning with confronting Napoleon through to the eclipse of Austerlitz. We see the comical ineffectiveness, or indeed it would be comical if there weren't lives on the line. We see this very early on in the first chapter. They are a shambles. In the brigs, this is page 116 to 7, we see that the men have holes in their boots from marching relentlessly. It's October 1805. And I rather like the symbolism of the holes in the boots, because in this part we will see that the Russians momentarily adopt the latest scientific battle tactics. And that of course means European, but more specifically French, more specifically still, Napoleonic. But the thing is about that strategy, when they adopt it, it's rather like wearing boots that have holes in them, and it doesn't work. We see that the Russians are continuously forced to delay and to deceive and then to retreat. The deception, the attempts to deceive, these are strategies inspired by Napoleon's own deceptions. And of course, Napoleon sees right through it. Indeed, there's a moment where it looks like they might have succeeded a little bit in pulling one over on Napoleon, but that's not his fault. And he is angry, and he tells them, march on the enemy. I didn't tell you to stop. March on the enemy right now. We see that the Russians try to march on the enemy. They try to blow up bridges behind them, destroy bridges, and that doesn't go too well. Again, through miscommunication. There's a moment where General Schmidt says, well, you didn't tell me to set fire to the bridges or blow them up. And the response to that is, well, we told you to put kindling there. We didn't think it was necessary. We thought it was obvious. We thought we had communicated the message clearly enough, but apparently not. And so what we see is the Russians try to adopt all of these strategies and they fit like boots with holes in, and it doesn't work, and it all descends into chaos and confusion and disorder. They are continuously forced to delay and retreat and try to buy themselves time. Now, a quick note on French or Napoleonic truces from the Kutuzov biography that I rather like. Alexander Mikaberidze draws our attention to Tsar Alexander's instructions to Kutuzov. We're told that the emperor seemingly anticipated an eventuality Kutuzov would face during the war. Whenever they are hard pressed, wrote Alexander, the French generals skillfully conceal their difficulties and instead offer truce negotiations under various fair-faced pretexts that in reality are designed to win them more time, to get reinforcements, or to secure an advantageous position from where they can attack their enemy. But anyway, we get quite the contrast between Napoleon's Grande Armée and Kutuzov's men. The troops arrive in Braunau in Austria, and we see that the wording of the orders they receive is not clear. How are they supposed to be dressed? They don't know. And so, in order to present a polished appearance to Kutuzov and a member of the Hofkriegsrat, which is the military authority for the Habsburgs, so Austria, they are ordered essentially to stay up all night cleaning and to swap out their shabby dress. The wording of the order was not quite clear. They didn't know if they should be in battle dress or full dress uniform, and so by morning the regiment, a straggling shambles on the eve of the last march, looked like an orderly formation of 2,000 men, everyone knowing his place and his duty. Buttons firm and straps tight, everything spick and span and gleaming, and not only on the surface. If it should occur to the commander-in-chief to check underneath the uniform, he would see that every man was wearing a clean shirt. There was only one thing that no one could be happy with: their footgear. More than half the boots had holes in them. This was no fault of the commanding officer. In spite of repeated demands, the Austrian authorities had left him undersupplied, and the regiment had now marched over 700 miles. Now, looking polished and spick and span is actually quite far from what Kutuzov wants. He wants to delay his men marching on the French. And the thing is, Austria, a coalition ally, and they really wish that they did not have to be allies with Austria. They didn't trust them, they didn't like them. Austria is urging immediate advance. So, Kutuzov wanted them to turn up looking a state, so that Austria, who they detest to their own detriment, would know that they were undersupplied. And then he could halt the prospect of immediate advance. Delay. Let his men rest a little bit. They've been marching and marching. They are tired. They're ill. They're kind of broken down. They could do without launching straight into battle. And at this point, Napoleon doesn't quite understand that the Russians are in such a state. He doesn't really know what they're like. So we could see that it's kind of to their advantage as well to remain an unknown for a little bit longer, just long enough for them to rest and recover. So they must put their shabby uniforms back on, which is an interesting strategy. And the enemy here is actually their ally. And we see this tension between needing to keep a coalition partner happy, but also Kutuzov not wanting to wear his men down even more. And there was a lot of diplomacy involved in the warfare. Russia at this time was keen for the other great powers to be aware of the fact that they weren't anti-France, they were anti-Napoleon. And then of course we get this irony due to the fact that many of the men in the Russian regiments respected Napoleon. And they respected Napoleon, certainly a lot more, than their coalition allies, like Austria. Now we can see a lot of demonstrations of what is known as face in psychology. There's this concept of face. We see a lot of face-saving discourse. We may say one thing when we're talking to another, but we really mean something quite different. We present a certain appearance because it is our face, or we present a certain appearance to preemptively diffuse a threat. Not a physical threat, but a sociological threat. And so the symbolism of the Russian soldiers dressing up when really they're quite worn down is an interesting one. Who we are, essentially, at our core, isn't who we present to the world. What we present to the world is a guise. And sociologist Irving Goffman, who gave us the term face in the 1960s, told us that we are always presenting a face that was developing, changing, and mirroring the world around us, and it would change depending on what we are encountering, what our environment is like, and where we find ourselves in the social hierarchy. Our face, how we act, how we speak to others, reveals quite a lot about how we want to be perceived by others, or how we feel we should be perceived. Pride, dignity, and honour are all wrapped up in this concept too. Pride is a manifestation of our need to fulfill our individual desires. Honour is a little bit different. Honour is about the individual's duties towards society or the group. So a little bit different but interrelated. Dignity is about our emotional or our physical needs in our social interactions. And we can see in the soldiers' interpersonal communications with each other, we are constantly aware of their different positions when they are discoursing. We can see that they are always acting in ways to preserve their pride, or acting in a way to preserve the honour of the group, and of course they have that really human need to preserve their own dignity. The thing is, they are not always, or indeed we could say hardly ever, successful in doing so. We see that when we're amongst the Russian troops, we might as well still be in the drawing room. We get that sense really profoundly, for example, with Dolokhov, the private Dolokhov, who has now been reduced to the ranks, yeah? Dolokhov is well connected, and everybody knows this, which means he can act in ways that would be considered insubordinate if somebody else were to do it. So he gets this dressing down, but it's a dressing down that's not really a dressing down. It's all for show. It's not really a punishment. He's even told outright that he will get his epaulets back. The epaulets are the ornamental shoulder pieces, which typically have an insignia that designates your rank. He's told that he is going to get those back come the first action he sees. So, has he really lost his status? Not really. And indeed, whilst we're thinking about what we are showing versus the substance beneath, whether we have epaulets or not, whether we are wearing shabby uniform or we're all dressed up, whilst we're thinking about what's external and what we are showing and the face we are presenting versus what's beneath, it's important to keep in mind that there is this split and this dichotomy running through the condition of war itself. Many young men will approach war from the external, from what it looks like, from an idealised perspective. And indeed, for much of history, warfare was show, and it was chivalry, and it was outward display. In medieval times, the peasants, of course, would be killed. But if you were a nobleman, you weren't really in any real danger. You were captured, and you were treated quite well by the enemy, and then you were swapped back. So it was theatre to a certain degree. That's why it's so shocking when we see Henry V at Agincourt go in and slaughter the nobleman. Because whilst warfare has always been horrific, that wasn't really the done thing. And indeed we see in the First World War, the machine war, where they still used the old tactics, and they realised that the old tactics were not going to serve in this new world, running into machine gun fire. And they knew they were going to get cut down, but they didn't know how to adapt to the brutal reality of what warfare had become. But even in the First World War, men would sign up, and before they realised the reality of war, it was all about looking polished, being respectable, marching in step. And then they get there, and the reality very swiftly settles in, and men would realise that a ribbon decorating your heroism, your valour, your courage meant nothing if the chest it was meant to be pinned to was eviscerated in a muddy field somewhere far from home. And so we've got to give it to Kutuzov. Yes, he was delaying sending his men in to help Austria, but he didn't want to frivolously, needlessly lose lives. Yeah, he cared for the lives of his men. He didn't want them to die for no reason. And we can see that this is obviously very frustrating to the Austrian general, who knows that it's not going well for their troops at all. We also see another parallel with the socialite world. On page 127, which is chapter 3, Kutuzov is being urged by the Austrian general to send his troops in now. And he's looking very unhappy, and he says, "We believe that the present delay is depriving the gallant Russian troops and their commander-in-chief of the laurels they are accustomed to winning in the field." And he's obviously prepared this in advance. He's trying to talk to Kutuzov in terms that would persuade him to go into battle, essentially on their behalf, to help them out. So there's a lot of face-saving discourse going on here. And Kutuzov bows and smiles and says, "But the last letter we received from His Highness the Archduke Ferdinand told us that the Austrian troops, under the command of so skillful a leader as General Mack, have already achieved total victory and have no further need of our assistance." And the parallel with the socialite world is this. Remember when the news of Pierre becoming Count Bezukhov managed to reach Maria before Julie Karagin's letter reached her? Gossip moves swifter than letters, and this is true in the world of drawing rooms and salons, and it's true in the world of battle too. They have been victorious under General Mack. Of course, this is not true, and that delay is going to be costly. Very soon we find that the rumour that the Austrians had been defeated at Ulm turns out to be true. And whilst all of this is going on, the Russians are rather concerned about the Austrians. They're concerned about the prospect of having to face Napoleon, but they're concerned about their coalition ally too. They are concerned that the Austrians are in secret peace treaty talks with Napoleon. They're concerned that the Austrians are not giving them all the information that they should, so they do not trust their ally one bit. Andrei says, well, if he had been beaten, we would have heard about it by now. And of course it turns out that he was, and that's not quite true. Well, they have heard about it, they have that rumour coming to them, and then they get the confirmation, and now they have delayed. Now, talking about Andrei, and we're going to oscillate between two primary protagonists in this section, Andrei and Nikolai. Andrei, we learn, is rather different, or has changed, apparently, since his time in St. Petersburg high society. Page 128 in the Briggs, this is chapter 3. We're told that although it was not long since Prince Andrei had left Russia, he had changed a great deal during that time. Tolstoy loves to talk about change. We see the word a lot and we see its demonstration. But how much has Prince Andrei really changed? Has he changed? We see that characters change from part to part. Indeed, they even change over the course of single installments, episodes. We can discern emotional change and outward change. But how much interior change can we discern? A good way to see the Tolstoic movement, because Tolstoy's prose is really always in flux, ever moving, ever evolving. There's a constant sense of change. A good way to mark the Tolstoic movement is to take a single episode or chapter and treat it like a short story, the kind of short story that Ernest Hemingway might write. A good exercise is to take chapter 9, for example, that's my recommendation, and pretend it is a standalone story, and that there is no more narrative before or after. If you do that, you will have a masterclass in the art of writing short stories. You will see movement. You will see change in a really compressed space. It's a really marvellous thing to note. Now, Andrei has changed in some ways, but in other ways he's still very much the same Andrei. As James Wood says, the challenge for Tolstoy's characters is being anything other than themselves. Andrei is happier at least for now, whatever that means, however he is defining happiness. But others still view him the way he was viewed in St. Petersburg society. Page 129, still chapter 3. On Kutuzov's staff, among his fellow officers and in the army generally, Prince Andrei was what he had been in Petersburg society, a man with two completely different reputations. Some people, the minority, considered him a cut above themselves and everybody else. They expected a lot from him. They listened to him, admired and imitated him, and with these people Prince Andrei was open and agreeable. Others, the majority, didn't like him at all. So where do we fall currently when it comes to Prince Andrei? Are we in the minority? Do we see him as a cut above the rest, or are we in the majority? Do we not like him at this point in the story? They saw him as petulant, aloof and thoroughly unpleasant. But Prince Andrei knew enough to ensure that even these people treated him with respect and sometimes a certain kind of awe. And so we might take this opportunity to wonder, who are we really? How much of our interior or our sense of identity is contingent upon how others perceive us? Is our social personality a creation of the thoughts of other people, as Proust would say? And if so, what are the implications for the great man theory and the idea of free will? And indeed, when we consider Napoleon, for example, there are very few figures who have so many different viewpoints or competing and conflicting points of view. So who is this man, if our social personalities are a creation of other people? Now, when news of the Austrians' defeat reaches them, notice the response that Andrei has. And this was a response that many of his Russian comrades felt and expressed. Page 130. Andrei couldn't resist a thrill of real pleasure at the thought of the arrogant Austrians suffering such a humiliation. But he was also afraid of Bonaparte's genius. This man might turn out to be stronger than all the brave Russian troops put together, and yet, at the same time, he couldn't bear to think of his hero being disgraced. So it's strange, isn't it? It's really complex, and Andrei's feelings are nuanced and layered and conflicting, and that is life, that is reality. It's not very straightforward, and war, confusion, trauma, pain, all of that forces us to confront with the messy nature of life. Like considering the great man theory itself, it's very simple, isn't it? History is but the mere biography of great men, the single cause and effect. It's very simple, but we could also say it's rather a fallacy and not like life. There are too many causes, too many variables, too many conflicting threads, and the same is true when we consider our own thoughts about things. We so very rarely, unless we're not thinking very clearly or deeply or robustly, can land on a very strong and single-minded position that is true across the board all the time. There are so many shades and nuances that must be taken into consideration. So we're marking how Andrei is happy that his allies, the arrogant Austrians, are defeated, and he's happy because it speaks to Napoleon's power, and he respects Napoleon. But you are now faced with the prospect of marching against your hero, and that's complicated because he could very well be stronger than your army, but on the off chance that he's not and you do win, you also don't want your hero to be disgraced. Can you imagine going into a boxing match and kind of wanting the person you're up against to win because you respect them so much? The reason there is so much trash talking before a fight is because the fighters need to get into that headspace. They need to think that they are the superior one. The moment you start to think, my hero, maybe he's stronger than me, then you've already lost it. And then to complicate matters further, he takes Zherkov to task for making a tasteless joke about General Mack. So there are a couple of things going on here. First, we see that Andrei is still playing at war, in much the same way that Pierre was playing at war in the drawing room, pretending to be Napoleon. Andrei has fantasies of being like his hero 2. We see that Andrei, he's quite a masculine figure, isn't he? And we have good and bad coming from that. We might see him as a kind of Byronic figure. At least I'm tempted to call him rather Byronic, but it's interesting because we typically use the term Byronic when we mean masculine or darkly masculine. But how much of a man is Andrei? How much of a boy is he? Is he an adult or is he a child? Perhaps he seems slightly more masculine, more adult, more of a man by virtue of who he is surrounded with. They're all still children though, really, aren't they? And another interesting thing that I note is that Andrei, in taking the men to task, Zherkov, taking him to task, in doing so, he's essentially talking to himself, isn't he? Have you ever had a go at somebody, in a kind of hypocritical way, had a go at somebody for something that you yourself either do, have done, or have felt? In that moment, with a little bit of self-awareness, you might stop, you might pause and think, who am I really talking to here? I'm having a go at somebody else, but is it because they are reflecting something of myself that I'm finding difficult to sit with? Am I really talking to myself? Page 131, Andrei says, "Sir, if you insist on acting like a buffoon, it is not for me to stop you. But if you dare play the fool once more in my presence, I'll teach you how to behave." And then he roars, "I'm not joking. Please be silent." And then he says, "Listen, either we are officers serving Tsar and country, rejoicing in allied successes and grieving together in defeat, or we're just hired servants who have no interest in our master's business. 40,000 men massacred and the allied army destroyed, and you think that's funny?" And then he says, "Schoolboys joke like that." Now, there are many great characters in this part of War and Peace. I love Andrei, I love Kutuzov, but I think this part ultimately belongs to Nikolai. And here we see a glaring example of how war can go from being something you have ideals about to suddenly having the experience of its reality. When you are immature, when you are innocent, when you do not have experience, war may seem like a great opportunity to display heroism, valor, courage. It may seem like a heroic enterprise. You're a child at play. But then you get into the thick of it and you realize that war is very far from being glamorous. It's actually confusing. It's disorienting. It's embarrassing. There's a lot of embarrassment in war, and it is terrifying. And you have all of these emotions that aren't really in line with what you might have expected of yourself. You want to be courageous, but then you find yourself filled with fear. You want to have a strong aim and purpose, and then you find only chaos and confusion, and you do not know what to do. That is the overwhelming sentiment, and it's a chilling sentiment that comes through in this part of War and Peace for me. This idea of, what do? I don't know what I'm doing. And that is something that many people who have gone to war say. When they're really in the thick of it, suddenly it doesn't seem so heroic, the ideals are gone, and they ask themselves, what am I doing here? It suddenly doesn't make any sense. And I believe that we've all had traumatic experiences, maybe experiences that we thought would never happen to us. And when they happen, we realise that we're not quite ready for them. In fact, we're not ready for them at all. Not only are we not ready for them, but they're nothing like we might have imagined them to be. And we find ourselves asking, what do I do? Yeah? In the heat of traumatic experience, and it's all coming at us very fast, we can only think, what do I do? We might wish that somebody could help us. Yeah? And of course, that is so much worse if your life is on the line. Now, before the battle really kicks off, we see that Nikolai's main concern is petty squabbling. Again, we see that this is more in line with the domestic world. So we see that the world of the salon and the world of the battlefield have a lot in common. Nikolai's squadron commander, Denisov, has been gambling and losing. Again, some nice symbolism coming through here. Think of the metaphor of gambling. What is involved in gambling? Are we playing a game of luck or skill? Can you believe it? Denisov says. He never dealt me a decent hand. Not one. Now, we often talk of not being dealt a good hand when fortune doesn't shine on us. And very soon, they will realise that there are worse things than losing at cards. You go into battle and you are gambling with your life. Now, this is where face, pride, dignity and honour come in, because Nikolai finds that Denisov's purse has been stolen by Lieutenant Telyanin, and he accuses him, doesn't he? But he, after arguing with their colonel, is the one who needs to apologise, like a little boy asking to go unpunished. Notice the language of little boys, schoolboys throughout. He must supplicate himself, because this whole affair would bring dishonour on the entire regiment. Nikolai feels rather like a beaten dog, or perhaps like a child who has done everything right at school, and perhaps he has done everything he can to bring justice to another naughty schoolchild, and he has ended up punished himself. Why do I feel like this is relatable? Like I've had this experience where someone else has been the one being naughty and I've ended up getting punished. Forget about personal pride, forget about dignity, and there's certainly no honour amongst thieves. It's all about hierarchy. No wonder Falstaff in Henry IV wants nothing to do with so-called honour. But hot on the heels of these petty squabbles, they are thrown into battle, and then we see that the petty, the personal, comes with Nikolai into battle. He cannot help but have it intrude and remain in his consciousness. All around him, the other soldiers are rushing in with high spirits. Many are drunk, they've been at the bottle, and they have an emotional energy that seems incompatible with what they're actually doing. Again, it seems like schoolboys, drunken schoolboys, at play. Reality does start to dawn on them, however, as cannonballs begin to whiz overhead. They gradually start to realise that this isn't a game, and they could very well die. And look at the feeling of confusion that Tolstoy gives us. That's what sends a chill through me. It feels so truthful. The sense of disorientation, the strangeness feels very truthful. Remember that great writers estrange, yeah? Great literature is estrangement. And a writer can make us feel at home in a strange place. That's what Shakespeare does. Or make us feel like an alien in a familiar place or a familiar world, and that is what Tolstoy does. Now, I'm not saying that the battlefield is supposed to feel familiar, but it is ultimately a stretch of land, isn't it? A stretch of land that is seeing military fire. And what once looked familiar, hills, trees, rivers and so forth, now becomes contorted and distorted into a nightmare. Chapter 8, page 153 in the Briggs. Nikolai's hand is shaking and his heart is pumping, and he can see nothing but troops all around him running everywhere with jingling spurs and clanking sabres. "Stretcher here!" called a voice behind him. It never occurred to Rostov what stretcher meant. That's brilliant. I think that's really profound. He just ran on, trying to keep to the front. But right by the bridge, running along without looking down, he slipped on the well-trodden mud, staggered and fell on his hands. The others ran round him. So it never occurred to him what stretcher meant. And so the words do not signify. In the heat of battle, things don't really make sense. Of course, stretcher means that people have been wounded and they need medical aid. But he just hears the words. It's so disorienting and confusing, he doesn't really know what the words mean. So in the heat of battle, everything looks very strange and unfamiliar and terrifying. And chapter 8, page 155 through to 156 in the Briggs, this passage is worth a deep read. We're told that Rostov, preoccupied by his relations with Bogdanich, had stepped onto the bridge without knowing what to do. Okay, so he doesn't know what to do. There was no one to slash at with his sword, which was how he had always imagined a battle would go. So how he has imagined the heat of battle is vastly out of line with what the real experience is actually like. And he couldn't contribute to the bridge burning because he'd forgotten to bring any straw. He was just standing there looking around when suddenly there was a great rattling sound on the bridge, like a scattering of nuts. That rattling sound is gunfire, and it sounds like scattering nuts. And that's very, very strange because the sound of scattering nuts, that's quite a nice sound, isn't it? It's from the natural world or it's from the domestic world. Maybe we go outside and we want to feed some squirrels, so we scatter some nuts. And nothing makes sense in the heat of battle, and a gun or gunfire sounds like something rather benign when we know it's anything but. We struggle to make sense of what is going on, and Rostov wishes he was back at home. He cannot comprehend the danger he is now in. Again, a voice called out, "Stretcher here!" "Oh, Jesus Christ, leave me alone!" screamed the wounded man. But they went ahead, lifted him and laid him on a stretcher. Now this is where we should pay close attention. Nikolai Rostov turned away and began staring into the distance, at the waters of the Danube, at the sky, at the sun, as if he were looking for something. How lovely that sky looked. How blue and calm and deep. Oh, the brightness and magnificence of that setting sun. There's a lot of interesting things going on here. So, sound and sense are no longer lining up, and Rostov, Nikolai, he wishes he was anywhere else but here. He looks to the sky and he looks to the sun. And as he feels the power of that lofty sky, he feels a sense of something good and something pure and something eternal that is not here in the chaos, in the heat of battle. And he thinks to himself, I would ask for nothing in the world if only I could be there. Where does he want to be? As he looks to the sky, he says to himself, in me, only in me and that sunshine, there is so much happiness. And here, all this groaning and agony, this feeling of dread, all the uncertainty, this rushing about, there they are, shouting again. Everybody's running back somewhere, and I'm running too, and here is death, hanging over me, all around me. One flash and I'll never see that sunshine, that water, that mountain gorge ever again. Just then the sun disappeared behind the clouds, and the dread of death, and of the stretchers, and the loss of all sunshine and life, everything fused into a single sensation of sickening horror. Dear God, who art in heaven, save, forgive, and deliver me, Rostov whispered to himself. And so we get an evocation of the Lord's Prayer. And Jesus gave his disciples the Lord's Prayer during the Sermon on the Mount. Our Father, who art in heaven. And in the book of Luke, we have his teaching that the kingdom of God is within us. The kingdom of God is within you. So when we say Our Father, who art in heaven, are we looking to an external source, or are we really turning inward? There is something of the condition of heaven, or something that reminds us of the condition of heaven in the lofty sky, in the sun, We see the majesty of this world, and that should ultimately be a reminder that the kingdom of God is within us. So Our Father who art in heaven, we are appealing to something divine that is essentially within us. And Nikolai notes this. He says the condition of heaven, the condition of peace we might call it, or something divine, exists in the sky and is also within him. It exists in the sun and is also within him, but it's not here, not on this battlefield. So if the battlefield and everything that is going on, the chaos, the disorder, the bloodshed, the death, if that's not heaven, then what is it? Well, it's hell, So heaven is within us and hell is here in the heat of battle. And the Lord's Prayer goes like this: Our Father who art in heaven. So that which is divine, that is within me, and is also in the lofty sky and the beauty of nature, that which is within me. Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. So make your kingdom, your condition of peace, a reality. Make it come here, now, in the present. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. So whose will is it? Is it the will of an external, or is it the will of that which is pure and good and eternal, that is already within us? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So we have this idea of will coming from within us, and we have that idea of earth here, the battlefield, and we have that impulse to exert something benevolent and divine over the condition of warfare. And the Lord's Prayer continues like this: give us this day our daily bread. So Jesus is keen to tell his disciples to remain rooted in the present moment. Don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Give us what we can deal with today. Give us our daily bread and forgive us our trespasses. And this is really interesting because I personally went to a Roman Catholic school and we are taught this prayer, but we're not really taught the meaning of it. We're told to repeat it without thinking. And so we kind of get the meaning a little bit muddied. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. This isn't continuous action. It's not forgive us whilst we're in the process of forgiving others. It's setting an example and saying we want to be forgiven to the degree that we are able to forgive others as we forgive others. It's an imploration to us to be forgiving because we will be forgiven in proportion to how much we can forgive other people. And so if we are really forgiving, then we will be forgiven. If we do not forgive, or we're too harsh with other people, how can we expect to be forgiven our trespasses ourselves? Yeah, it's that concept of he who is without sin cast the first stone. And of course, none of us are without weaknesses, and we read through Tolstoy's War and Peace and we interact with these characters and we understand them and we understand ourselves. So forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Are we talking to something external or are we talking to ourselves? If the kingdom of God is within us, this is self-talk. We are telling ourselves that we will forgive ourselves in proportion to how much we forgive other people. So if we can forgive other people, we can ultimately forgive ourselves. And I think it's interesting because we do get that split, that interplay between the external and the internal in War and Peace. And we see this in our own lives too. So often we think that the external is going to save us. But we know ultimately, whether we are conscious of it or not, that everything is internal. Because we want externals to influence internals. Yeah, we want an external to change how we feel on the inside. And whether we try to obtain this through the glory of battle, whether we try to dabble in drugs and alcohol and we think that's going to make us feel good inside, whether we get really wrapped up in our external identity, who we think we are, what we do, our profession, for example. We have all these externals, how other people consider us, and we allow them to weigh upon our inner, and we shouldn't. We got it the wrong way round. Happiness comes from within and works its way out. It doesn't come from outside external sources and work its way in. And we might continue to contemplate this as we move back to Andrei. We see that Andrei is feeling rather proud. We're told that he is feeling the beginnings of a long sought after happiness. But where do we find our happiness? If it is in external things like battle, like glory, then perhaps it's not quite happiness we are describing. He's having these dreams, these memories of battle, and he sees it as a victory, a moral victory at least. He expects for a moment to be taken before the emperor, but he is instead taken before the minister of war, the kind of men who, in Andrei's mind, have never smelled gunpowder. They think winning victories is the easiest thing in the world. We see that one man's victory is certainly another man's defeat. It's all about perspective. And Tolstoy wants to give us a lot of perspective. We meet Bilibin, a Russian diplomat of Andrei's acquaintance, who is described as one of a vast army of diplomats. Nice language again, an army of diplomats. Think about that. And he tells Andrei, well, your victory wasn't very victorious. Andrei says, well, it's not like being on the parade ground. And Bilibin takes him to task and says, why didn't you get there earlier? And he says, I know what you're thinking. It's not difficult to capture a marshal sitting on a sofa by the fireside. But then perhaps we might want to keep that in mind if we find ourselves thinking, well, you should have done this or you should have done that, or coming in, weighing in with some judgment, which is very easy to do when we take a historical perspective, when we are looking back. Yeah, it's all retrospective. Hindsight is most certainly 2020. Much easier to say you should have done this or you shouldn't have done that when we are sitting by the fireside. And at this point in the story, Andrei still idolises Bonaparte. Bonaparte, who is giving orders out of Schönbrunn. For a while, when I lived in Vienna, I lived right around the corner from Schönbrunn Palace. It's an absolutely beautiful palatial ground, really impressive to walk around. What an amazing genius that man is, Prince Andrei says about Bonaparte. And whilst it's important to note that Andrei still has Napoleon as his hero, he's also still playing at war. And he closes his eyes and instantly his ears rang with cannon fire, muskets discharging and rumbling wheels. He could see a long line of musketeers running downhill and the French firing back at them. He could feel his heart miss a beat and watch himself galloping to the front with Schmidt. He can see himself in his mind. He's outside of himself, with bullets whistling all around him, and he was once again enjoying that tenfold delight in living that he had not known since childhood. And then he woke. Yes, it really did happen, he told himself, with the happy smile of a young child before relapsing into a deep, youthful slumber. He's still playing. And he's described as being like a child. And even though Andrei's sense of happiness is based on externals, this idea of being a great man, fighting gloriously, not being confined to the drawing rooms and ballrooms, he's very much in his own head, isn't he? Which I think many of us can relate to. As introverts, and I think Andrei is an introvert, if you know your Myers-Briggs personality types, I believe Andrei is an INTJ. As introverts, we have these long-running monologues and discussions with ourselves and fantasies and daydreams that very often span many years. We have these long-running thoughts in our minds, and we live very much in our minds. But sometimes reality interrupts us. And it's very strange to be plunged into the real world and to be yanked out of our dreams. And we find that the real world is not a dream, but rather a nightmare, and doesn't have a lot in common with the rosy dreams we've been indulging in. I think we see this when Andrei is at the bookshop, and then all of a sudden, it's war, There's battle again. There's some really nice parallelism going on with Nikolai and the petty squabbles over who stole what, and then battle. So we see Nikolai is having these petty squabbles, and then they're thrown into battle, and then we see Andrei is browsing at the bookstore, and then it's battle again. Chapter 12, page 169. He stops off at a bookshop to stock up on reading material for the campaign, and he stayed there for some time. When he finally reached the steps of Bilibin's house, there stood a carriage, half stowed with luggage. "What's happened?" asked Bolkonsky. "Oh dear, Your Excellency," said Franz. "That villain's at our heels again." And so suddenly the familiar feels very unfamiliar, So one moment we've got cannonballs whizzing overhead, and now we're browsing for volumes in a bookshop with Andrei, and then Napoleon has marched across the bridge without a shot being fired, and they're packing up and they have to leave. And we see that Andrei is still in a fantasy world. He now sees this as his chance to step up. This could be his Toulon. And that's a reference, of course, to Napoleon. That's where Napoleon first won significant promotion, at Toulon. So what's Andrei really saying? He's saying, in seeing this as his potential Toulon, that he could be a great man. He could exert his will on reality. He could be like his hero, Napoleon. He could make history. Speaking of Napoleon, we also get the first significant entrance of this historical figure as character. We get his words in the form of a letter, and we see that the Russians are trying to use his own tactics against him, trying to deceive him, but Napoleon sees right through it. And he says, "You are losing for me the spoils of a whole campaign. Break the truce and march on the enemy. March on and destroy the Russian army." And we see Andrei wonders where to find his Toulon. So there's something of a poetic geography going on here. Geography that's also temporality, because Toulon, France, is over 800 miles away from Schöngraben, Austria, and Napoleon at Toulon is now 12 years in the past. So the prospect of finding 1793 in 1805 and the prospect of trying to find France in Austria is about as likely as Andrei finding his glory in this moment in time. What he finds is quite different. He finds chaos, confusion and disorder, and no one knows what they are doing. But amongst all of this, we get Tolstoy loading or foreshadowing some spiritual meditations to come in the language he uses. Amongst the chaos, we have saluting soldiers described as being like priests blessing, and the crackle of musket fire is described as soul-stirring. Andrei is astounded to observe that no orders were really given, and Andrei notices that everything was happening by pure chance and had nothing to do with the commander's volition. Not only that, but Andrei himself feels as though he's being pulled along by an otherworldly force. Page 195, chapter 18, he's being drawn forward by an irresistible force, and he also had the sensation of supreme happiness. This supreme happiness is something of a delusion or an illusion and will not last, because we see that Andrei becomes bitterly disappointed by what war really is. We're told that to Prince Andrei it was all so strange, so unlike what he had been looking forward to. And we end this passage on Nikolai in a delirium, in a delirious dream, and Nikolai feels much the same way as Prince Andrei. We see that when he was in the heat of battle, chapter 19, page 199, he's flung from his horse and he says, "Something's gone terribly wrong. Do things like this really happen? What do you do?" He kept wondering. Then he suddenly felt that there was something dangling on his numb left arm that shouldn't be there. The wrist seemed not to belong to his arm. So we get a sense of dissociation, and a sense of who are we really in the midst of this chaos and confusion. Are we our body? What is this corporeal entity? But not only that, the dissociation arises by virtue of being wounded. He stares down at his hand, looking for blood. Oh look, someone's coming, he thought with great delight, seeing some men running towards him. So the confusion thickens. They'll help me. Yeah, he wants help. He doesn't know what to do. This is not what I expected. What am I supposed to do? Oh great, someone will come along and help me. No. One of them said something funny, not in Russian. And then he realizes that one of his boys is being taken prisoner, and then he sees the Frenchmen running towards him, and everything seemed so ghastly that he couldn't believe his eyes. Who are they? Why are they running? They're not after me. They can't be after me. Why? They can't want to kill me. Me? Everybody loves me. He remembered all the love he had from his mother, from his family and his friends, and the idea of the enemy wanting to kill him seemed absurd. But they might want to. He'd been standing there rigid for more than 10 seconds, not taking anything in. And the Frenchman was getting near, and the sight of this rampaging foreigner's face as he sprinted breathlessly towards him with fixed bayonet suddenly terrified Rostov. He grabbed his pistol, and instead of firing, he hurled it at the Frenchman and dashed towards the bushes as fast as his legs would carry him. He was running now like a hare chased by dogs. His whole being was reduced to a single sensation. He was terrified and running for his young and happy life. We end part 2 of volume 1, which is chapter 21, with Nikolai, who, wounded and now disillusioned with the reality of war, opens his eyes and looks up. Night's black canopy hovered only a couple of feet above the firelight, through which snowflakes were fluttering down Tushin had not returned, no doctor had come, he was all alone, except for one soldier sitting naked on the other side of the fire, warming his skinny, yellow body. Nobody's bothered about me, thought Rostov. There's nobody to help me, nobody to feel sorry for me, and to think I was at home only the other day, all strong and happy, and with people who loved me, he sighed. And the sigh turned into an unintended groan. Rostov gazes into the snowflakes swirling above the fire and thought of Russian winters at home, warm and bright, snug in his cosy fur coat, with a speeding sledge, rude health, and his family with all their love and tenderness. And he wondered, why did I ever come here? Let us know what you made of this second part of the first volume of War and Peace. Our next discussion will involve the next 100 or so pages and will take us to the end of Volume 1 and the beginning of Volume 2. Thank you very much for reading along. Thank you for watching today, and happy reading, everybody. Bye-bye for now.